and gentlemen, please be seated. Our program is about to begin. Please welcome Rachel Oppenheim, Chief Revenue Officer for Semafor.
Good morning and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for Semafor's Navigating Regulatory Waves Forum. I'm Rachel Oppenheim, Semafor's Chief Revenue Officer, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here. It's an interesting time in Washington to kick off a program designed to discuss the evolving role that regulations play in private sector growth and innovation. Today's leaders are navigating uncertainties, and Semafor, as a news organization, is just incredibly proud to help illuminate those complexities here on stage. When Semafor launched 3 years ago, we set out to create the definitive global news platform for decision makers by delivering trusted intelligence for a new world economy that is increasingly defined by complexity and interconnection. Today, Semafor is a trusted voice with over 5 million engaged readers, nearly 1 million newsletter subscriptions, and a live journalism business that's becoming a magnet for newsmaking impact and influence and ideas. In just 3 years, we've created this very distinct kind of news brand, of course, credible and, most importantly, focused on those who are shaping the future and equipping leaders to act with clarity and with conviction. So in just a few minutes, we will hear from those leaders who are tasked with navigating the shifting regulatory rules, the consumer demands, and the business priorities, operating in markets that are, genuinely evolving at a quicker pace than the rules that shape them, and seeing the effects on their companies and organizations' strategy, on competition, and on consumer access in a profound way. So before we begin, just a very sincere thank you to our partners at Reynolds American for powering today's live journalism and for their support. We're very, very appreciative for all of you being here this morning and for your participation in making conversations like this possible. Thank you so much, and let's get to the news.
Please welcome Ethan Lane, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and Eleanor Mueller, Congress reporter for Semafor.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here with us today, and thank you, Ethan, for making time.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure it's been a very busy week for you.
Nice and calm as usual in our nation's capital and in the U.S. cattle industry. Nothing to see, nothing to talk about.
Nothing to see. Of course, we heard from the Trump administration last week that the president wants to try to import more beef from Argentina. What have you been hearing from the industry as far as what they make of that idea?
Imports are always a really touchy subject in the U.S. cattle industry. This is an industry that produces right now the highest quality beef I think the world has probably ever seen, and I'm talking about as far as taste and marbling and those attributes that we've historically pursued in the U.S. cattle industry. We're doing that with the lowest environmental footprint we've ever seen because of the efficiencies that our system has built in with that feedlot model and kind of that, that genetic investment that's been made in our supply chain. And our producers are rightfully very proud of that product. So whenever you talk about those imports, it's a pretty touchy subject. The reality is this is also the best beef market in the world. This is the best beef eating consumer base in the world, which means we sell everything that we can here at home to that audience that's looking for that taste and that mouthfeel that we produce with our product. But to meet that ground beef demand, to meet some of those demands that are beyond sort of that obvious kind of middle of the road, we need lean trimmings. We need some of those things that aren't produced in high enough quantities here in the U.S., particularly because we seek that high marble carcass, right? Consumers they want a marbled fatty ribeye and they want lean ground beef. And as it turns out, those two things do not come off the same animal in the right quantities. So those lean trimmings from grass-fed systems become a very important part of how we put that mix together that meets that consumer demand. So yes, by definition of that, we need trim from different systems around the world. That becomes a real issue when we start talking about countries that maybe don't meet the same food safety standards as us, or maybe we don't have confidence that what they're reporting meets the reality of how that's being executed. When we talk about animal disease, we talk about concerns about the potential for FMD, foot and mouth disease, or other animal diseases that might find their way into the U.S. system and cause some really devastating consequences. So it's a necessity to make sure that we have that system flowing properly, that we're sending the 10 or 11 or 12 billion dollars worth of product overseas that we don't have markets for here, tongues and offal and things like that, and bringing in that trim that we do need. But it's really important that those countries be at our level as far as trading partners, and that's been our concern with some of those South American partners in particular. Is it's difficult to make sure that we're really getting what we think we're getting, and that those processes in country are happening the way they should be to meet our satisfaction as a supply chain and as an industry.
Yeah. I'm assuming some of those concerns have been related to the Trump administration over the last few days.
I do believe they now are very clear on that. There has been a pretty loud outcry from producers across the country. I think we helped facilitate close to 40,000 letters to Capitol Hill last week. About 10,000 producers weighed in. For the cattle industry, that's a pretty big deal. We have about 750,000 cattle producers in the country, give or take, and most of them are in a business where you're kind of out by yourself for a reason, right? They're people that aren't big joiners. They're not people that necessarily want to hang out in big groups or engage in some of that social media chatter. But this was one that really piqued their interest, and I think that everyone in the city that works in those different areas or that is an elected official heard in stereo from their constituents last week about this.
Well, it seems to be paying off. There are a lot of Republicans who aren't typically vocally critical at all of the administration who were open in the last couple of days about their concerns about this decision. Do you think that there's a chance we see the administration reconsider the plans?
I think the reality is for us, it's not so much the Argentine trim, right? At the end of the day, there's not enough there for it to really move the market. I think an analysis I saw the other day said it might lower the consumer price by 6 cents a pound. Mm-hmm. That's probably not going to be the rock anybody's church is built on. I think the reality is we are still a very free market focused industry, which means we believe the cure for high prices is high prices. The consumers are still showing up at these higher prices and buying our product, again, because the quality level is meeting that expectation. We're seeing them shift around which cuts they buy. They might have gone from New York strips a few months ago to, say, a flank steak and some ground beef today, but they're staying in the category. And that tells us that while, yes, it is expensive, it's not yet at that point where they're walking away from it and going to pork or chicken or something else. We're very confident in our industry that the consumer will let us know when it's too expensive because they'll stop buying it and they'll go to a different protein choice. But until that point, we still have these underlying fundamentals of very low cattle supply. Some of that is cyclical, some of that is drought-driven, some of that is COVID market-driven, and a sustained high demand for our product, which is the kind of conditions that a lot of producers look at and say, man, I've been waiting for a long time to pay off debt and get well from COVID and recover in my operation so that I have something that I feel like is worth passing on to my kids and generations after that. And so psychologically, they're just now 4 years into a good market, starting to feel like it's a good market. So this really hit them at a rough time. Also because it's the fall, which means a lot of producers around the country that calve out in the spring, we're just now making decisions about whether to retain heifers and rebuild their herd or sell those heifers at historically high prices. And what they heard from the administration, an administration that a lot of them voted for, most of them voted for, was, I think you should take less for your cattle. So while the White House and USDA has made it very clear they want to work with us to rebuild the herd, which we would love, the message that was sent last week was the exact opposite.
Wow. What do you think, this experience has taught us about the way that the Trump administration approaches regulations under this second go-around?
That's a great question. I think that and I've been here longer than probably is advisable, and I've been through a few transitions at this point, and you kind of have this feel, right, for a Democratic administration coming in and what that feels like as far as downtown talking about the onset of regulations, and usually that's the return of some awful thing that some industry or another has been battling for years, right, with the federal government. And in a Republican administration, you sort of expect that you're going to see a little deregulatory move. What's been interesting this time relative to the last Trump administration is the lack of sort of regular order APA processes, real deregulatory processes. And I think for a lot of us, because we spent so much time last year talking about Chevron deference, we talked so much about the post-Chevron world and what that would mean for all of us in the regulatory community. Here we thought there'd be a lot more sort of field testing in the courts, right, and seeing what the limits of that really were. And all of us very confidently predicted at the time that Congress would have to play a larger role in sort of giving very specific guidance to the agencies. And we're not really seeing, I don't think from a regulatory perspective, any of that at the scale that we would expect. And I think even inside this sort of set of circumstances over the last week, we saw, this obvious several offhanded comments from the president, all of them market movers in our very small, volatile market in the U.S. cattle industry, right, to the detriment of producers, followed by this plan that was released that is all items that we in the industry have asked for a very long time. But the question then becomes, what does that look like from a regulatory perspective to actually execute? Because it's great to have the talking point, and it's great to say these are things we aspire to achieve over the next couple of years, but those of us that work in the regulatory side of things look at that and say, that's a 2-year process, that's a 4-year process, that's a 5-year court case after the 2-year process. And it doesn't look like you're starting those in enough time to actually have success with those. And so what does the timeline look like to implement those? And I think that's where we're sort of looking for some maybe better feel of what that's going to look like as for execution rather than just the, kind of the opening starter's pistol on that.
That's fascinating. What do you attribute that delay to?
I don't have a good sense for that. I don't know that anybody outside of the administration does. I think that there are, and we've said this repeatedly, this Trump administration has done a phenomenal job appointing political appointees in these agencies that truly understand their work. There are some really, really good public servants in these agencies that know what they're talking about. These are not unachievable processes. It's always difficult in a big tent. And I've talked about this a lot in talking to producer groups, right? The coalition that elected the president looks very different this time than it did last time. And I think that disparate those different disparate voices that don't typically see the world the same way, whether it's the Maha end of the universe versus farmers, right? Or just anything in that kind of populist umbrella, does make it more difficult to figure out kind of where your North Star is, right? It's not a pure ideologically conservative administration. It's just not. Yeah. And so I think that inherently creates a bunch of challenges that there are opportunities as well, I'm sure, but as far as sort of executing on a regulatory agenda in Washington, I think that probably creates more challenges than it solves.
Difficult to predict.
I would think, yeah.
Yeah. Did you think at this point we'd see more legal tests of the Chevron deference?
I did.
Precedent being overturned?
I did.
Yeah.
And look, I get it. For any of us in those industries, no one wants to be the guinea pig. You want to be the first one after they figure it out, right, to go through the process.
Second guinea pig.
But yeah, I think we did expect to see more by this point. And that's not, when I say we don't know what the limits are, that's not like, gosh, how much can we get away with? I think it really is, what are we really talking about? Because I think those of us in the regulated community spend a lot of time explaining to our stakeholders, this isn't a one-sided deal, right? I think a lot of people mistakenly looked at Chevron and said, well, this is great, right? The federal government's never going to be able to do what they've done to me again. Well, that cuts both ways. You deregulate by regulating. You still have to go through the process. And so I think there's a real lack of understanding that you really need to work through this to figure out what is the limit of what an agency can do with a vague statute. How far can they go? And what's the court going to say about that? And how are we going to establish that? And then you have a framework by which they can promulgate new regulations, and we have some reasonable certainty that they're going to stick.
Well, do you have any advice for folks in other industries who are looking to navigate an administration who, to your point, is not always ideologically consistent?
I don't mean this to be flippant, but it's an observation of the times that we're in. If you can find a way up front to get a hold of the social media aspect of your industry, I would strongly recommend you do that early. This is an administration that places an incredibly high value on social media, on influencers. They don't seem to have a huge amount of concern about whether those are real or sort of, a creation of the internet. That's, I think, a lot about sort of their assessment of where their voters' heads are and how perception is playing out for what the administration is doing. But it can lead to a target-rich environment for whoever, right, to really manipulate a narrative with a pretty modest investment, quite frankly. It's not that expensive to fire up a bot farm and have a bunch of, kind of shills on the internet, put on some fake cowboy hats, truly. And I think that's been our reality for months now. And I don't think we're the only industry where that's the case. If you're kind of looking at this from the outside and saying, God, that looks like a mess, do not underestimate. And I think back to my days running campaigns, congressional campaigns 15 years ago, the smallest budget line was your digital spend, right? Now it's all anybody wants to talk about. The reality is that's probably true more so for us downtown than we've given it credit. And probably something we need to be thinking about moving forward, because I don't see that getting, lessening in the years to come. I see that being an area where more people see opportunity for a little bit of investment to go a long way. You don't need $2 million in TV spend anymore to manipulate a conversation. You need the right few influencers and the right bots kind of powering up. And we're a grassroots industry, so we take pride in the fact that we don't need that. But when you're getting outspent and outgunned by, computers, it's a very frustrating situation.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
You bet.
Really appreciate you making the time.
Happy to be here.
Please Please welcome Elaine Round, Senior Vice President of Scientific and Regulatory Affairs at Reynolds American, Mariam Mahika, Chief Public Policy Officer at General Catalyst, Rakia Pippins, Partner and Co-Chair of Consumer Products Group at Arnold and Porter, and Amna Nawaz, Co-host of PBS NewsHour.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me back. Thank you to all of you for being here as well.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
So we're going to jump right in because we don't have a ton of time and we have a lot to cover. Elaine, I want to begin with you, and I should also note Elaine is with Reynolds American, who is, of course, a partner with Semafor in today's event, so thank you for your support there. But let's start talking about the team that you lead at Reynolds, which is responsible for FDA submissions, right? We're going to talk about the science behind innovation. So walk us through what the approval process, submissions process even looks like these days. How different is it today compared to the past?
Well, it's interesting. It's actually pretty new-ish, I think, for FDA anyway. So FDA gained regulatory authority over tobacco products in 2009. And so it's and a lot of the regulations are based on device and drug. But it was very much contemplated just in terms of actually tobacco leaf, so cigarettes, chewing tobacco, that kind of thing. So these new innovative products that are alternatives to smokers, such as nicotine pouches, vaping products, were not contemplated at all in the Tobacco Control Act. And so I think because they weren't contemplated there, and because there's been a huge influx of applications for vaping products and for nicotine pouches to the FDA, the process for applying for marketing, which would be through the pre-market tobacco product application process, has been incredibly slow. It's been inundated with all of these new innovative product innovation applications. It's been incredibly slow. So that it requires a huge amount of robust science, so rigorous science, quality, product information, manufacturing quality, that kind of thing. So all of that being packaged into these big applications that in theory are supposed to be reviewed by FDA within 180 days. And in reality, we've had applications sitting with FDA for over 5 years that haven't moved.
5 years in some cases.
So it's a long time. And but I will say that just in the current administration, they've really kind of embraced nicotine pouches as being less risky, their words, although not risk-free. And so they've implemented this pilot program, a fast-track review program for FDA review of these applications that, in theory, is hopefully going to meet that 180-day deadline and really be able to support innovative new products getting to market a lot sooner.
How is it they're able to fast-track them? What are they doing differently?
Well, it's interesting. In the past, to be able to have a conversation with FDA, you write letters, you have to, you apply for kind of pre-market or phase 0 meetings to actually talk with FDA, but they've actually committed to biweekly phone calls. So we've had, just in the last 6 weeks, we, for example, are participating in this program with 2 of our applications. We've had 3 phone calls with them, and basically kind of the exchange of information of, helping them understand where things are in the applications, and then them helping us understand exactly what they're looking for. And so it's been much more of, I'll say partnership, but definitely collaborative in terms of how we work with them to hopefully get the applications through the review process sooner, with still the same rigorous science. So there's no compromising of the scientific rigor, and that will underpin that would demonstrate the products as appropriate for the protection of public health. That's the standard.
Rakia, let's talk about a couple of other product lanes, food and cosmetics in particular, where we've seen an explosion in interest when it comes to clean products that are labeled organic. And especially now we've seen this overlapping policy push with the administration's MAHA movement and the report that they've put out, and just a lot of consumer demand as well. What does it mean for the approval process for things like food and cosmetics?
I think what's fascinating is that there is no formal approval process for food and cosmetics. Most of the regulation comes after it's entered the market, with the exception of 2 categories that we find we always have to remind clients about. So one of the emphasis of the MAHA movement is this idea of traditionally foods could come into commerce if the ingredient was considered to be generally recognized as safe. But a company could decide whether it was generally recognized as safe on its own. It was referred to as a self-GRAS process. There's been some pushback on whether that is appropriate and whether instead you should have to go through what's referred to a food additive process of getting approval from the agency. I think that's where you might see some change in the future, but it's going to take years of kind of back and forth through the rulemaking process. For cosmetics, generally, you don't have to have pre-market approval for any of the ingredients unless it's a color additive. I mean, there's basically an understanding that for those ingredients, they could present unique safety considerations. So you would find that, for example, some colors are permitted in your hair, but you can't put it around your eyes or things like that. And I think what's been really interesting is seeing that as more and more companies want to bring products that are used freely in other countries into the US, or having to really acknowledge ways in which our system hasn't necessarily modernized or hasn't permitted certain ingredients for use, or an alternative where we're permitted to use ingredients here that are no longer permitted outside of the US. I know that typically when people say cosmetics, they think all personal care. I think a big nuance I always have to flag is in the US, there is a difference between a product that's just for beautification versus something that is supposed to affect the structure or function of the body. So if you're like reducing fine lines or wrinkles, FDA actually thinks those products are drugs. And so a nuance we often are seeing in the cosmetic space is people wanting to market products here without triggering a drug classification that would require pre-market approval. And so we're figuring out more ways to help companies know how to modify claims to avoid that, or if they want to be able to get into market, figuring out how to take advantage of some new pathways for over-the-counter drugs, et cetera, to permit more innovation.
And similar to what Elaine was saying in terms of a change from one administration to the next, have you seen that it's any easier, any faster, that there's more of a partnership with the agencies in this new way?
So what I would say is one of the beauties of the country that we live in is that it's a federalist system. And so you can't just look at what's happening here within the Beltway. So whereas it may be a perception that there's less activity in certain areas at FDA or at the federal government, there's definitely a lot more activity occurring at the state level. So you could take something like food that I mentioned here. There is maybe some general discussion of whether we want to consider what ingredients can be used at the federal level, but there hasn't been action. In contrast, there are states who are now requiring you to potentially label your food saying, this product contains an ingredient that is not permitted for use in Europe. It's a different management system. And so I would say it's been very active, just in different ways, mostly through state regulation.
So Miriam, take us kind of big picture here now, because you've worked both inside government and outside. You've led on everything from tech and national security issues. In your role at General Catalyst Institute now, kind of give us your view on this regulatory environment that Rakia laid out so well too, where there's sometimes conflict between what's happening at the federal level and the state level, and how companies are managing that.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to be here today. Thank you for having me, and I'm honored to share the stage with the company here. And so I would just flag that they're right on point in terms of there is obviously, especially Rakia mentioning the federal and state level. One example of that is AI policy and tech policy. We are seeing that play out. And we saw it play out previously with privacy. For those of you that don't know, General Catalyst is a venture capital firm or a transformation and investment company that we've invested in over 800 companies across all critical sectors, including defense, energy, financial services, and of course, healthcare, which we've made a big investment recently, we just announced. And so one of the things that I think is exciting about these days that we were talking about, there's some caveats, but this administration has been very eager to partner with the private sector on areas where they can find faster, better, more efficient solutions for some of the challenges that we face across multiple sectors. Now, obviously, moving fast, which we've all acknowledged, is great in certain respects, but you have to be ready to, as we were discussing in the green room, to pivot when maybe a new administration comes in, or there's a change in policy in the current administration. So understanding that you need to have that flexibility, it's something that you just need to build that trust and to prepare yourself to move in different directions depending on where those policy winds are going. But I think it's an exciting time, and we are definitely trying to, one of the existential issues for startups is this regulatory uncertainty. Now, big businesses don't like it either, but it can be really existential for startups that are bringing these transformative technologies to the market and want to try to see them scale for not just the US market, but globally. But when you have a patchwork of policies across the states, that can really be a huge issue, which is why we, along with many others in DC and across the country, would prefer to see, for example, a federal framework for AI policy. That's something, again, that's cross-cutting in all the industries I mentioned. And when you start seeing a patchwork, as we saw with privacy, that can really cause not just expense and burden, but for the smaller companies, it can be, it could be something that really makes them be able to thrive or just end their business at a dead end. So it's something that we're actively advocating for across our portfolios.
When you say it's existential, talk about the innovation piece of it, because you think in a more nimble environment where there's more of a partnership at the federal level and between the larger companies in particular, that would foster that innovation. That would say, go ahead and try new things. So you're saying the risk is then borne by the startups.
It is because of what Rakia mentioned about the federalist system, and that we just see so much. There have been over 1,200 AI bills introduced at the state level. And at the state level, on average, if you look at the data, 20 to 25% of bills pass at the state level. And that shouldn't be surprising because these are single-party legislatures. At the federal level, we see 3 to 5% of bills pass due to, you could call it gridlock or you could call it bipartisanship that they're trying to achieve. But the two-party system is obviously a challenge. And so while the federal government continues to try to make frameworks happen and come into fruition, sometimes it takes several Congresses. We had the AI moratorium, and if you asked Congressman Obernolte from California, he said, I was surprised. He's a huge AI champion and trying to bring about some sort of certainty at the federal level. He said, I was surprised at how far it went, because sometimes it takes several Congresses to actually achieve something. It could move faster, let's say in California or in Texas or Florida. But again, it's a proliferation of this patchwork of policies that part gets very challenging for a startup to think, I need to comply with California and Florida and Texas, and they're just waiting for the federal government to try to bring about some sort of certainty nationally.
Rakia, from the company perspective, from the investor perspective, everything everyone's saying here underscores there's a balance here, right? Between speeding innovation, supporting innovation, and also ensuring public safety, right? That things aren't just being rushed out to test on the general public. So what should companies, what should investors be doing that they're not doing already to foster a safe environment for the consumer as well?
That's a great question. I would say one of the things that we always emphasize with our clients when they're focused on innovation is thinking about internal controls and data collection modules that they can use so that if the risk profile changes or an administration changes or there's something that says you can no longer use data that has a likelihood to produce X, it's easy to click a lever that just disaggregates or takes away that data without losing the entire system. I know one thing that came up in the privacy context, especially dealing with some prior FTC consumer protection priorities, was that when there was an issue, they ended up having to disgorge and get rid of everything that they had collected because they didn't have internal systems or controls in place that would help them to maybe remove certain data sets or rejigger something if it was seen as something may have a discriminatory outcome or that there was some bad data that was entered that couldn't be removed. So we're having a lot of conversations with clients on how we can both take advantage of the innovation that they want to implement and take advantage of what feels like an open market in some respects, but also think of traditional unfair and deceptive advertising practice or other risk profiles that we expect could come into play in the future so that when necessary they can implement it. And I think it helps them to feel like they've managed the risk a little bit more without creating a environment where they can't be competitive. Because the worst thing that could happen is that you're restricting yourself when no one else is playing by the rules, and so you're kind of dead before you even started.
Elaine, how do you look at that? Especially in, I guess, what we can call sort of a regulatory gray area around nicotine alternatives, which the FDA does not have explicit authority to regulate, right? So how do you look at this balance between the innovation and the risk?
Well, actually, I think regulation is so important for innovation. I think it really provides a level playing field for people. At least I know for our industry, I think having the rules in place, I know, Miriam, you were basically alluding to the same thing. It's like having the rules in place allows for responsible innovation. So it allows for kind of that big science-based approach in nicotine and tobacco industry, for example, to demonstrate that products are appropriate for the protection of public health. It also allows for that responsible innovation in the way that also prioritizes, in our case, appropriate alternatives for smokers and prioritizes the quality, high quality products that would be appropriate there. I think also it needs to be balanced with, at least in our case, enforcement actions. I mean, so there's so many illicit products out there, so many illicit disposable and vaping products in the marketplace, and with those kind of running rampant, it's really hard for the kind of responsible manufacturers to bring the right products to market. So I think that balance is super important, but also then with those products out of the market, that really provides the opportunity to bring appropriate, ideally potentially less risky products to adult smokers.
So do I hear you saying more enforcement or better enforcement and also more explicit regulatory authority would be better for the industry?
Yeah, I know. It sounds like heresy, doesn't it? But yeah, I mean, Reynolds in particular, we very much value sensible regulation. We want that kind of regulation to make sure that we've got the level playing field. We know the rules to play by. We know kind of what the expectations are to get high quality products available, alternate products available to smokers. Absolutely.
So, Miriam, how do you see, like in an ideal scenario, for painting one here, what does that kind of collaboration look like between the private sector, between the FDA or other regulatory agencies, research institutions that are funding and fueling the innovation? How do you ensure that the regulatory systems keep pace with the emerging technologies?
Look, I think it takes patience and trust to begin with. That's the foundation of anything you want to see.
We have those in abundance in Washington, D.C. right now. I'm not sure.
But I'll give you two examples of that. We're excited because we just announced a huge investment, which is very unusual for venture capital, but of acquiring a health system in Ohio, Suma Health. And it's a $1 billion investment, and it was a long road of working with local regulators to really lay out the parameters of what that investment meant, that this is a long-term investment. We want to make healthcare more affordable, more proactive, more accessible. We have a system where we treat the sick. We want to treat the healthy to sort of give the system incentives to keep people healthy, to keep costs lower. But at the federal level, for example, and so that was a long road that we got, we accomplished hand in hand with the state government and with the Attorney General of Ohio.
When you say a long road, what was the process for that?
I'd say, it was a 2-year process from the healthcare system itself, the community, the government. There are many stakeholders involved. But at the federal level, for example, we want to introduce AI to make, we have a healthcare system, which we saw during COVID, that we have shortages of nurses. We want to use technology to go from a mindset of scarcity to abundance. And a good example of that is if there's a heat wave, we could have agentic nurses to call 400,000 seniors simultaneously and talk to them about how they're feeling, and just from their breathing patterns and how they're responding to some questions to know if someone needs medical care. We just don't have the nurses and capability to do that without technology. But getting the HHS and the federal level to feel comfortable with non-diagnostic, non-clinical, but AI agentic nurses coming in for those categories. 'Cause a lot of people feel a little nervous when, I don't know how many people in the room would feel good about if I told you, what if you talk to an agentic nurse instead of a real nurse about your problem and you just describe what it is? Some of you might say, well, if I'm just talking to someone about how I feel, maybe I'm okay. But there's still a lot of reticence in introducing technology for these areas which impact human beings, and you have interactions with them. So I think it's a long process of not just talking through how the technology works, the impact of the technology, but what are the safeguards? And how is the system going to trigger bringing in a human being? And at what point do you bring in a human being? And what checks and balances are in place? So it's a lot of stakeholders involved. Industry is a stakeholder, government, community, the public, and healthcare of the patient. But that is cross-cutting in all the industries. I think that you have to really figure out how to build that trust and that foundation and making sure the parameters and regulations are in place to make everyone feel comfortable.
So patience and trust. Rakia and Elaine, I'll come to you for final words here. And that example of Suma Health, I think, really helps to hit home what those kind of partnerships and collaborations can look like. Do you have examples of those kinds of things you'd point to as something to hold up?
Yeah, well, I would point to the ones that have existed for the rulemaking process. I mean, there are requests that are sent out by agencies to collect comments on future regulations that they're considering. I think it's really important that we take advantage of that process, not only to help inform and educate the agencies about the industries that they're going to be developing rules and regulations for, but to create an administrative record so that if there is an issue, you can address it, through the court system. So I would say absolutely participating through rulemaking processes, and also there are a lot of public meetings that are held by agencies. We have to be engaged, and we have to take advantage of those opportunities to provide them the industry perspective. Because I will tell you, from having a family full of government employees and people who have dedicated their time to it, sometimes they don't know that private industry is well-intentioned too. They need the other perspective to help inform that process.
Elaine, I'll give you the final word here.
Yeah, and I just echo what Rakia said, actually. The same goes for us. I mean, really participating in the rulemaking process, comments, periods, workshops with FDA in particular. I think the other thing for us, being from scientific and regulatory affairs, scientific part, really publishing, really being very active in the scientific community, not just industry, but academia, public health, publishing all of our research, making sure we've got that peer review process in place to really validate and get feedback to make sure that we're doing the highest quality science we can that feeds back into the regulatory process.
And patience and trust. I'll come back to this
and
again
trust.
and
Yeah,
again.
exactly.
Thank you so much all for
Thank
being here.
you.
Please join me in thanking Elaine Round, Rakia Pippins, and Mariam Mujica.
Welcome North Carolina Democratic Representative Deborah Ross and Eleanor Mueller, Congress reporter for Semafor.
Back, and thank you, Congresswoman, so much for taking the time this week to come and hang out on stage with us.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
So your state, North Carolina, is, of course, home to the potent research triangle, and so you are familiar with innovation as well as what it takes to legally protect it. As a member of the House Judiciary and Science Committees, you've championed multiple proposals to improve the patent system. The Trump administration recently proposed charging fees to holders of patents. Should Congress push back on that idea?
Absolutely, Congress should push back on it. And as a matter of fact, we had bipartisan, bicameral legislation that passed called the Unleashing American Innovators Act to actually lower patent fees and give more assistance for first-time patent applicants. And I think this trying to take something away from the patent holder doesn't really understand how innovation works. And so, of course, there's innovation that goes on in big companies, but really the innovation that we see that produces these breakthrough drug treatments, technology, it comes from our universities. It comes from people setting something up in their garage. There are so many first-time patent applicants who have never really been through the process, they don't know how much money they're going to make off of this, and they don't even think about it at the time. They're thinking about curing a rare disease or coming up with a different way to communicate or a different way to launch a satellite. And to tell them that they can't get a patent unless they think about how much money they're going to make later is to not understand that economy. And I know we have a lot of questions, but one of the great things about Unleashing American Innovators is it recognizes that if we don't help those first-time patent holders, we are going to lose innovation that comes from our rural areas, people of color, from the military, from people who are exactly what this country was founded on. There is a reason why protection of intellectual property is in our Constitution. And to say that you only have to think about what the final product might be rather than having that spark of creativity is just the wrong kind of incentive.
Absolutely. So how can Congress go about, resisting this idea, conveying to the administration?
So we are working on a bipartisan pushback, and I can't reveal it yet. It'll be revealed soon. But we do have a bipartisan group of House members who are pushing back on this. We're hoping to get our Senate colleagues to push back on it as well.
Awesome. What do you make of, so separately, the president has talked about firing the head of the U.S. Copyright Office. I mean, what do you make of that decision?
Well, the president violates the Constitution left and right. He has no respect for it. He has no respect for things that are foundational in this country. And it is so important that the head of the U.S. Copyright Office is an independent person, because copyright should know no favoritism. I'm very suspicious right now of infringing on copyright, particularly by AI. And we've seen major litigation about this with Anthropic, which lost a huge part of one of its suits because it was using copyrighted material to basically get all the data for AI to learn without paying licensing fees. There have been some great articles about the people who brought these lawsuits and how they had spent years either writing something, producing something, and then AI just thinks they can pluck it away. I mean, there's a reason why we protect intellectual property. It's so that we create that incentive. And again, it is foundational. It is in our Constitution. Our founders were innovators. They understood that the king wanted to take their innovation and take their means of finding either a great idea or themselves monetizing it. That's why we put that in the Constitution, and it needs to be respected. And that's why people come from all over the world to the United States, because we don't have a government that grabs up their innovation like so many other countries in the world.
You mentioned AI. Your congressional Republican colleagues earlier this year proposed banning a state regulation of artificial intelligence, in part so, or at least they said lawmakers can draft a federal law. Mm-hmm. Is that something you see this Congress being able to pull off in the next couple of years?
This Congress can't even convene. So I would love to have a bipartisan bill on AI. We've talked about it in the Science Committee. We've talked about it in the Intellectual Property and Courts Committee of Judiciary. But while Congress can't act and doesn't act, it is important that the states act, and they have acted in some pretty important ways. They've acted to prevent deep fakes. They've acted to prevent election interference by AI. They've acted to prevent AI from acting like a psychiatrist and leading to kids committing suicide. And these are not just, bright blue states that love overregulation. These are states that have seen the real adverse effects that AI can have if it is completely unregulated. And waiting for Congress at this point, given our current situation, is simply unrealistic. And in certain areas, and traditionally states do regulate in certain areas. They regulate in medical areas, they regulate in family law areas, all sorts of areas that are not really the purview of Congress. They should be able to take steps to protect their people.
Speaking of the House not convening,
yes,
we are, I believe, a week as of today away from this being the longest government shutdown that we've ever had. What do you see as the most likely conclusion to this shutdown at this point?
Well, my great hope is that the senators will come up with a bipartisan solution to both opening the government and dealing with these impending health care issues. I mean, people on November 1st are going to have to start picking what their health insurance plan is going to be under the ACA. We have seen the premiums skyrocket. We have seen deductibles and copays skyrocket. Many of the senators admit that we have to deal with this issue. So I am hopeful that the Senate will come up with a plan that they can send over to the House. I am not hopeful that the House would be able to do it on its own, since Speaker Johnson doesn't even want to convene and swear in a new member who was duly elected more than 4 weeks, I think it'll be 4 weeks ago tomorrow. I mean, it is absolutely ridiculous. But the senators tend to be the grown-ups in the room, and I'm hoping that they get themselves together and do that. I know that our senior senator, Tom Tillis, has always been in the middle of those kinds of bipartisan discussions, and I'm hopeful that he will use his influence again.
Another big issue that we've all been tracking is this issue of redistricting, which your state has been at the center of. The Republican legislature is on track now to implement a plan that the Democratic governor, of course, cannot veto. Do you expect legal challenges to that plan to prove successful?
So there already have been legal challenges. The issue, I don't think any legal challenge in our state Supreme Court will be successful, because our state Supreme Court has become so high. I see these good nodding heads. Yeah, our state Supreme Court has become so highly partisan and is really just an echo chamber for our General Assembly. I mean, the Senator Pro Tem's son is on the Supreme Court. This is just very incestuous. But I'm hopeful that the U.S. Supreme Court will not fully gut Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The district that was drawn or redrawn in northeastern North Carolina would have never passed a Section 5 scrutiny, but we know that the Supreme Court got rid of preclearance and Section 5. So now you have to prove that there's a history of racial discrimination in a certain area. I'm hopeful that the Supreme Court, despite the reporting, will see that we still need Section 2 in certain parts of this country. But I don't think it will be resolved in time for this next election. And that is just really criminal. I mean, people are being disenfranchised. The African-American communities in northeastern North Carolina only got representation of their choice in 1992. That's the first time. We are not talking a long period of time. And they absolutely disregarded that history and drew districts where it would be very difficult for an African American to win in that part of the state. But there is a chance, even with the R+, I think it's R+11, in the area that Greg Murphy, his district, I think it's NC3, I think an African American or somebody that the African American community picked as their choice could win in that area. It's got medical centers, more history of racial cooperation, and even though it's a Republican district in a wave year, that could be interesting.
Well, part of the reason we're seeing Republicans, scramble to redraw some of these districts is because typically the midterm election after a president is elected, the opposite party gains seats. So obviously, there's still a chance that Democrats could win the House. What types of oversight could we see from the Trump administration, if Democrats were to get back the gavel?
There will
Congress?
be robust oversight of the Trump administration if the House goes back to the Democrats. And I think that's one of the things that Trump is terrified of. Right now, the Judiciary Committee barely does its job. It's really just an apologist for the Trump administration. We spend more time talking about Joe Biden in the Judiciary Committee than we do Donald Trump, not on the Democratic side, but on the Republican side. It is, and sometimes the hearings are comical. I mean, talking about violations of First Amendment rights under the Biden administration, and then not talking about violation of First Amendment rights under the Trump administration, it's absolutely insane. So we have a new, very dynamic oversight ranking member, Robert Garcia from California. He's been doing a great job in the minority. Jamie Raskin is the ranking member of Judiciary, not a shrinking violet. I think he will be up to the job too. And we'll see oversight, but not just in those two committees. I think we're going to see oversight in the Science Committee. The Science Committee is a very bipartisan committee. We passed a reauthorization of the National Weather Act, totally bipartisan. And we don't want to see the scientific enterprise further compromised. We have very good hearings, even with Republican leadership, with Republican witnesses. We are having a lot of consensus in that committee. And so I think we're going to see robust oversight from top to bottom.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Congresswoman. We really appreciate it.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you.
Welcome Robert Zirkelbach, Chief Public Affairs Officer and Head of Strategic Initiatives for Pharma, and Morgan Chalfant, Deputy Washington Editor for Semafor.
Robbie, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
So I wanted to start to just kind of look at, we've seen a lot of pretty amazing drug innovations in the last couple of years, treatments for Alzheimer's, HIV. What's next?
I think that's a great question. I love that we're starting off the conversation that way. Oftentimes when it comes to our industry, the first thing people jump to is cost, and we have a conversation about dollars and cents, and sometimes miss what's really happening in the science and what it means for patients. And as we look at this, there's really this convergence of a couple of things happening all at the same time that give us a tremendous amount of hope for what we're seeing in the pipeline. One is just the advancement in science and our understanding of the human body and the nature of disease is progressing faster than ever before. At the same time, scientists in our industry have tools they've never had before to fight diseases in entirely new ways. So think CAR T therapies, where we're literally taking cells out of the body, teaching them to fight cancer and putting them back in the body, and eliminating cancer in some cases, or immunotherapies or cell and gene therapies. And now you add the advent of AI and the potential to take all of that knowledge and speed it up faster than ever is incredibly encouraging. And if you think about just the last couple of years, as you mentioned, whether it's new treatments for HIV/AIDS that now you can take a twice-yearly pill and prevent the disease. First treatment that we've had in ever for Alzheimer's or in many decades for schizophrenia, and then think about what GLP-1s are doing to transform the fight against chronic disease. My mother is currently going through breast cancer, and she has a particularly aggressive form. 20 years ago she wouldn't be here with us, and today she's doing fine and fighting through it because of the amazing innovation in our industry. And it reminds all of us how personal it is for me and for everybody in this room and for patients around the country what's really at stake in this entire conversation.
Mm-hmm. And I do want to get to drug prices, but first I wanted to ask about something that's on everyone's mind this week, which is the meeting between Presidents Trump and Xi in South Korea for later this week. Pharmaceuticals may not come up, but drug innovation, drug trials is actually a pretty big part of the U.S.-China competition. Do you think the U.S. is losing here?
We're not, but we need to make sure that remains that way. The U.S. is the global leader in biopharmaceutical innovation, and it's that way not by accident, but by a series of strategic policy choices that we have made over the last 40 years. I'll give you a few examples of those. We passed something called the Bayh-Dole Act that actually allowed universities to commercialize the research and the investments that they get from NIH. What that has enabled is the industry and academia and government to work together to incentivize and develop new treatments. And it's really what spurred the research clusters that we see in places like Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Research Triangle Park in North Carolina, or the Bay Area in San Francisco. We passed legislation called the Hatch-Waxman Act that created our IP system we have today that said, look, we're going to make a deal with the industry. You can have a series, number of years on the market of exclusivity, but then everything goes generic, and those medicines become 90% off, and they stay that way in perpetuity. Today, 90% of every drug that a patient takes is a low-cost generic medicine that is far cheaper than anywhere else in the rest of the world. That's because we made a strategic choice. We've created the PDUFA legislation that had created our current FDA system that is the envy of the world. Before that, 70% of medicines were first approved outside the U.S. Today, 70% are first approved in the United States, and patients get access to them faster than anywhere else in the world. And I mention that because that is why we've been able to go from really a laggard. Europe used to lead the whole world in innovation, to leading the world and getting all of the benefits of the research happening here in the U.S., those drugs being manufactured here, and patients being able to get access to them first. Today, we have to make additional policy choices because China is on the rise. A decade ago, China barely had an innovative pharmaceutical industry. It was mostly generic. Fast forward to today, 30% of all the clinical trials around the world are happening in China. For comparison, 35% are happening in the United States. They have the fastest growing pipeline in the world. And I think we need to make a decision, at a time when, we're seeing our policies move in the wrong direction with more government intervention, less marketplace competition, more onerous regulations. China said, we're going in the opposite direction. We want to lead the world. We see this as a future industry, and they're making it more attractive to do investments there. And so our hope is that policymakers will think about and recall what we've done over the last several decades and double down on making the U.S. the most attractive place in the world to do innovation and to bring new medicines to patients. And we think that's the right way to address the issue.
And speaking of government intervention, the administration has obviously been trying to take steps to lower drug costs. I think there's, pretty broad agreement, even in today's Washington, that drug costs are too high and that there should be some way to, bring them down and make them more affordable. Why do you see the administration's strategy as flawed?
Well, first off, I think there's a lot of areas of common ground. We would be the first to say, in too many cases, patients are paying far too much for their medicines than they should. But we need to understand the root cause of that. In our view, there's three main reasons why we're paying more, particularly when you compare to what we're paying, in other countries. One is if you look at our current marketplace here, 50 cents of every single dollar that this country spends on medicine goes to a middleman in the system that had no part of actually developing and bringing that medicine to the marketplace. And that's in a couple of buckets. One are pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs. They're the ones who are hired by insurance companies supposedly to negotiate lower prices for medicines. They're the ones who decide what what medicines are covered, what patients pay to access them, what hoops they have to jump through. They're very large entities. They're able to negotiate significant rebates and discounts off the price of medicine, but increasingly they're keeping a big chunk of that for themselves, and patients aren't benefiting from that. We have a similar problem in the hospital arena. There's a technical sounding program called 340B, but essentially this is a program where hospitals are able to buy medicines at a discount for as little as a penny, and then mark them up by as much as 1,000% and keep the delta. This was a program that was designed to help 100 hospitals in the 1990s, and today half of hospitals are able to participate. It's a $66 billion program, more than the entire Medicaid program, not just what they spend on drugs, but everything they spend on healthcare. And increasingly, policymakers are realizing you've got to address these big misaligned incentives in the system that's driving up costs here in the U.S. And then the other area is we need to look at what other countries are doing. Increasingly, other countries are underpaying for medicines. They're not paying their fair share, and as a result, the U.S. is footing the bill for global innovation. One analysis showed that Americans are paying 26% higher prices for medicines because of other countries freeloading off that innovation. The administration has talked about all of those areas, about wanting to reduce the role of middlemen in the system and get other countries to pay more. They've been using their trade authority to try to put pressure on other countries. We think that's the right way to go. Now, where we disagree is doing something like most favored nation policies, where we would actually set prices based on those flawed prices in other countries. Those are the same policies that drove the industry out of Europe and to America, and we certainly wouldn't want to impose those exact same policies in America at a time when China is rising and trying to take over global leadership.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask you about another fight that you have with the administration, which is the prospect of pharmaceutical tariffs. Mm-hmm. What kind of impact would that have on U.S. consumers if the administration did move forward with those kind of tariffs?
Yeah, and we think doing a tariff on medicines is the wrong approach for a number of reasons. First, historically, medicines have always been exempt from tariffs because there's a real concern about the impact that would have on the cost of those medicines. There's a risk of shortages if it makes it harder for those to continue to be developed. And at the same time, this administration has really urged the industry to do more manufacturing in America. And our industry is stepping up. In fact, just our member companies have announced over $500 billion in new investments in the U.S. In just the last few months, we've seen groundbreakings in Indiana, in Ohio, in Maryland, Virginia, California, Texas. I could go down the list. And the reality is that every dollar that we spend on a tariff is a dollar that we can't spend on investing more in U.S. manufacturing or investing more in R&D to bring more of those amazing medicines to patients.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, would you expect, prices of drugs in the U.S. to go up considerably as we've seen kind of other goods that have been affected by tariffs?
It's certainly the risk. I think there's a risk of what this would do to the cost of medicines. I think there's a risk to what it would do to the availability of medicines and shortages if companies have to, you think about, because I mentioned earlier, 90% of all the medicines patients take are generic medicines with very little margins and very little room for error. And if you have to, if all of those entities now have to pay a tariff, you're going to see higher costs and you're going to see shortages.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, what's your engagement been like with this administration? Do you feel like you have a good, you can get through to them, there's a conversation there?
Yeah, there's an open dialogue and engagement on all of these issues. And, as I mentioned, in quite a number of these areas, there's, a lot of common ground. I think there is common ground that we need to tackle, the role of middlemen in the system to try to bring down those costs for U.S. patients. President Trump was actually the first to propose a regulation during his first term, and unfortunately that got repealed during the Inflation Reduction Act. But they're committed to try to continue to see reform across the finish line. They've taken steps to address the 340B program I mentioned. I think you think about the work that they're doing at the international arena to try to get other countries to pay more of their fair share for innovative medicines. So we're encouraged by the opportunity to find common ground in areas like that.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, the other topic, in addition to the president's trip to Asia and that meeting with Xi, is obviously the government shutdown, which is, we're covering every day at Semafor. Does that affect your day-to-day work at all, or is that kind of a side issue for you?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, everybody wants to see the government funded and operating, as it normally does. The area that impacts our industry the most around the FDA and the ability to get medicines approved, we haven't seen the same level of impact because a lot of that work is actually funded by user fees through it's not through appropriations. And so we are seeing the FDA regular processes and approvals continue, which is good. I think we wouldn't want to see anything that delays availability of new medicines, but we're watching this as closely as anybody else, and we'll see what the weeks ahead look like.
And my last question is just about Capitol Hill and possible movement on any sort of policy legislation you'd like to see. So if you can wave a magic wand, what would you like to see Congress pass? And I mean, do you think there's
any space for bipartisan cooperation in this area, in today's Washington?
Yes, I think we are, optimistic. I think arguably the only area of bipartisan agreement in healthcare these days is that we need to reform the pharmacy benefit managers and the role that middlemen play in driving up cost. There is bipartisan legislation. You've seen members of Congress on both sides of the aisle say they would like to see it and like to see it as soon as an end-of-the-year package if something moves forward. I think there's some important provisions there that would do a couple of things. One, ensure that patients can begin to benefit from the rebates and discounts that these pharmacy benefit managers negotiate. Today, PBM gets a discount and a patient has to pay the full price when they go to the pharmacy. Let's make sure they can actually get a lower price. And two, let's change how PBMs are compensated so that they're not incentivized to steer patients to the highest cost medicines that are more expensive for them, even if it just pads the bottom line of PBM. So, that's the one we're watching for this fall, and we're optimistic we'll get something across the finish line.
Robbie, thank you so much for this great conversation. Great. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Please welcome Brian Crawford, President and CEO of the Beer Institute, and Amna Nawaz, co-host of PBS NewsHour.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
I'm great. How are you? Thank you
good.
So much for having me.
Thank you for being here. We're going to talk about beer because it's 5 o'clock somewhere. But I do want to start with where the industry is in the shutdown, not just because it's Washington and we always talk about the shutdown first, but there's actually a huge impact on the beer industry right now, right? Tell me about it.
There is, and let me preface this by saying it pales in comparison to what we're seeing with our federal workforce. I lived through a shutdown when I worked on Capitol Hill, and so I want to make sure that I sort of state that at the outset. Sure. But when you think about the beer industry, we're highly regulated, and we have multiple different regulators, our main one being the Alcohol, Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, TTB. They're missing a couple acronyms in that, or letters in that acronym. But they have an incredibly important function for the beer industry. So they collect and remit taxes, which I think is probably happening during the shutdown. Mm-hmm. But they also approve all of our formulas. Mm-hmm. So every beer that you consume has its formula reviewed and approved by the TTB. They approve our labels, our packaging, and they also grant permits to make sure that you're a legitimate business. All of that is shut down right now. So if you're a small brewer and you have a seasonal beer that is set to come out for the holiday season, that might not come to market. If you have a formula for a beer that's set to come out in the spring, that's probably on hold. If you have plans to expand your brewery or make capital improvements, that's largely on hold. If you were a new brewer and you were planning to come to market, you're not going to get a permit. Mm. The other aspect is a lot of small brewers use SBA 8A loans. Yeah. Those aren't being utilized right now. And so there are real world impacts on the beer industry, but ultimately they pale in comparison to the larger issues that we're seeing right now.
And in terms of the impact on private industry, it's sometimes we don't think about this kind of ripple effect impact. And so what's the timeline on those kinds of approvals? Like, are these, if you're looking ahead to like autumnal beers, those are already out, right? You're not looking at holds up on that, but Thanksgiving is coming up. I know there's probably a big season for your industry, and there's some talk the shutdown might extend through there up until then. What does that mean in the way of potential loss?
Yeah, let's hope it doesn't extend that long.
For a number of reasons.
But it's certainly, the Christmas season will be impacted.
Yeah.
The spring season is when the formulas. So the formulas take months and months and months to get approved.
Okay.
You need to make sure that consumers are not drinking a product that has something that could be harmful in it, mm-hmm. right? And so that takes a lot longer. Labels and the packaging products, that's a quicker turnaround. TTB is a small agency within the Department of Treasury. Mm-hmm. And so any shutdown is really impactful because they have people across the country that are experts in this field. They are not deemed essential, and so they're not working right now.
And it's not just production that's so heavily regulated, right? It's also marketing, it's advertising, all under the TTB. Tell us about the intention behind those rules. How do those impact what you do and how you do it?
So the beer industry, just backing up, we were founded in 1862 as the U.S. Brewers Association. We're one of the oldest trade associations in all of Washington, D.C. We were founded during the Civil War because brewers came together to oppose an excise tax increase to fund the Union Army. So there's a lot of old industries. I sort of thought that guns or railroads might be older than us, but apparently we've been around longer than they have been. So, but since Prohibition, the beer industry has put forward advertising and marketing regulations. And it is hugely important for the industry to make sure that you are marketing our products in a responsible manner. And there's a couple of ways that I would sort of explain it to you. The number one being all advertising, whether it's a TV ad, a radio ad, a print ad, has to be directed to 73.8% of consumers that are of legal drinking age. That's done by the census. So when you think about it simplistically, our advertisements for beer will never show up on the Disney Channel or on Nickelodeon. We will not use any images or likeness that appeals to a younger demographic. So you'll never see a beer ad that includes Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny. And that is because we are marketing a product that is not a health product. It is an intoxicant, and it is designed only for those individuals that are of legal drinking age. So all of these advertisements come before our advertising and marketing code. Our members must abide by it, and it is governed by an independent outside appellate body called the Code Compliance Review Board. That is made up of individuals that are not connected to the beer industry. So we have a former AG, we have the former head of the University of Texas school system, the chancellor, we have a broadcasting executive. They review the ad code. It is a living, breathing document. So when you think about the rise of new social media platforms like TikTok, they are updating the ad code to make sure that those ads are in compliance, all the new social media platforms. And so a simple example that just popped up recently was there was a billboard ad for beer that was pre-existing. A charter school was placed near that billboard, and the school called and said, that billboard is too close to our school. And so it was the brewer's responsibility to take that billboard down. And so responsible marketing and making sure that we are targeting LDA consumers and only LDA consumers is hugely important to the industry.
So on the social media, this is fascinating to me because I just realized I've never seen Santa Claus in a beer ad, but I didn't realize that until you said that. On the social media part of it, just in terms of the regulations, to what degree does that responsibility extend? Because obviously you can't control what some very powerful voices online, social media influencers, people with huge platforms, how they're using or presenting your product. Where does your duty or responsibility meet what they're able to publish?
So we can't control companies and industries that are outside of the BI ad code. So one of the things that we do is all actors and models that are in all of our advertisements have to be 25 years or older.
Okay.
When it comes to the digital platforms, we're seeing examples time and time again of irresponsible marketing. Now, the Wine Institute, Discus, the Distilled Spirits Council, they have their own separate ad codes. They largely align with ours. Ours is probably the most rigid. But another example, and you guys have probably seen it, there's a recent ad. You'll never see anyone consuming alcohol in any of our ads. Again, it all goes to responsible marketing, making sure that we are targeting LDA consumers. All of our companies partner with companies like Nielsen IQ to make sure that those demographics are actually accurate. And so it is a huge part of what we do in the industry.
When it comes to how heavily regulated you are as an industry, I know you've made this comparison between some other industries, like the hemp industry, for example. So how differently the regulations are, because as you said, you're under the Treasury Department, you need federal formula label approval for any product, even if it's just sold in a single state. Why is that comparison illustrative to you? Tell us about that.
So hearkening back to everything I covered. So the beer industry pays $3.3 billion in excise tax every year. All of our labels are approved. All of our formulas are reviewed and approved. All of our permits are officially licensed. We have regulations through the FDA, through the TTB, and it's not very often that you see a highly regulated industry come up and say, our regulator is plays a hugely important role in our industry.
You're not saying you should be less regulated.
Correct.
Yeah.
In fact, I might argue the opposite. But the TTB ensures an orderly marketplace. They ensure consumer protections, and they ensure that we have a level playing field, that every beer company can compete on a level playing field when it comes to regulations. None of that can be said for those that are in the intoxicating hemp space. They don't have to comply with any of the things that I just spoke about. Now, I don't want to paint that industry with a broad brush. There are companies in the space that are responsible actors, but there are bad actors that are promoting intoxicating products that are derived from hemp, utilizing the Farm Bill language from 2018, and selling products that have 50, 100, 250 milligrams of intoxicating THC in a 12-ounce can. That is not responsible marketing.
And you note the 2018 Farm Bill because there was this loophole in there, right, where basically if it's less than 0.3% THC, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
So the 2018 Farm Bill, Senator Mitch McConnell was leader at the time, put in language to help tobacco farmers in the state of Kentucky who no longer had a crop to grow. And the idea was to promote industrial hemp as a means to offset the loss of tobacco. What's happened is aspiring entrepreneurs have figured out that you can take hemp and synthesize the THC and make an intoxicant the same as alcohol, and there is irresponsible marketing. Just recently, Governor Mike DeWine put forward a ban on intoxicating THC in the state of Ohio. He held up a bag of gummy nerd clusters. We were talking about our daughters. Mm-hmm. My daughter would live on gummy nerd clusters if I allowed her to.
Easily.
Held up a bag of gummy nerd clusters and compared it to a bag of intoxicating hemp that looked exactly the same. These are the types of things that our children can get access to. Direct to consumer. Intoxicating hemp drinks and products are being shipped directly to houses right now, today, as we speak. And so there is a need to address this. Congress is trying to address the hemp loophole. Mitch McConnell, who put the language into the Farm Bill, is now the lead champion to fix the language that he inserted into the 2018 Farm Bill. Just last Friday, 39 states' attorneys general wrote to Congress and said, you have got to fix this problem. And I'm paraphrasing, but they said, it is causing consumer harm, it is hurting our children, their law enforcement is struggling, and Congress needs to do something. And so it's going to be a big issue. It's going to continue to be a big issue, both through the appropriations process, whenever Congress comes back, and then also when the Farm Bill gets reconsidered.
And I should note we're going to hear from the hemp beverage perspective in just a moment as well. But I'm assuming this is concerning for you also because they're obviously going after some of the same consumers you are, and we're talking at a time when you're seeing a drop in overall beer sales, right? You have younger Americans or fewer younger Americans who are drinking alcohol of any kind. Why do you think that is, and how and should the industry be pivoting and reacting?
So a couple of points. One is there's certainly headwinds for all of beverage alcohol, and we readily acknowledge those, but we view them more as cyclical than structural. Okay. And when you think about the demographics, you have baby boomers who are aging out of their main consumption years. You have Gen Zers who are now coming of age who are facing real difficult situation. You know, the economy is tough. They're faced with the largest student loan debt in recorded history. And so it's just a demographic shift that we're seeing right now. Now, beer continues to be the number one beverage alcohol in the country, and we're proud of that factor. Our consumption rates have been steady, notwithstanding the headwinds that we're seeing. And the key is beer is innovating, right? So beer is leading the charge in developing new non-alcohol options. Mm-hmm. Beer controls 86% of the non-alcohol marketplace, and so it's really important. Beer is the beverage of moderation. We're innovating and we're meeting the consumers where they are. And so as the younger generation that is more health conscious comes up, I think that they are going to welcome beer as one of their options. The last thing I'll say, just reverting back to hemp, is that I would be very cautious to market and sell and advertise a product that is clearly an intoxicant, which is designed to inebriate somebody and then impacts your mind and body as a wellness product. Because that is a slippery slope, and that will certainly draw the ire of regulators beyond TTB and the FDA that have real authority to do something.
We're going to get a response to all of that in an upcoming panel as well. Brian Crawford of the Beer Institute, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Please join me in thanking him.
Welcome Ricky Silver, CEO of Daily Harvest, and Gina Chon, Executive Editor for Semafor.
Thank you, Ricky. Although I am definitely checking my kids' Halloween bag after that conversation. But thank you for being with us. As CEO of Daily Harvest, you were pretty quick to endorse the Make America Healthy Again movement with the new administration. So I wanted to start off just setting us up for why you felt that way, what was broken about our food system, how we give choices or not give choices to consumers to have a healthy eating lifestyle, just to kind of help set us up.
Yeah, well, maybe it's worthwhile to even ground everyone with my background. To start, I was both a chemist and a personal chef early in my life. And so I've always sort of been at the intersection of food and science and problem solving. And so I think throughout my career, I personally identified that, the system itself typically does a good job of dictating how businesses will optimize. And we went, for many decades with a food system that was the primary job of the food system was to deliver calories at the most efficient, in the most efficient capacity. And we lost a little bit of for me personally, and for the company who've really been advocating for now 10 years in our existence around making organic fruits and vegetables more readily available for individuals, leveraging great technology like IQF freezing. We wanted to make sure that we were influencing and involved in a way that was clear that the problem identification that's emerged from the MAHA movement is largely honing in on the right problems. That's not to say that all of the solutions proposed I've agreed with, but I think it's the right conversation to be having right now because we have an opportunity to change what the system is optimized for, but that's going to take a lot of hard work and commitment.
Yeah, and I want to get into the details of some of that, but I wanted to get your thoughts on working with this administration, particularly at Health and Human Services, where, there's some thought that some of the people in the administration are a little bit more combative or hard to work with, but I think you have not found that in your experience.
Well, I think we've always tried to show up, and represent what, our own, perspective, but that perspective is largely informed by doing our job to listen. So we've always been a company and a brand that goes out to the farms and listens to what we're hearing from farmers, particularly organic farmers. And so coming to the table with those perspectives where it's less about what's good for Daily Harvest or what's good for the business, but more observing and sharing stories that I think help contextualize the problems. That's been, I think, our entry point, and that's why it's been successful, not just with this administration, but with past administrations as well. We're able to tell the stories of the Montana farmers who we visited that are, urging their local, state, and federal government to give them more support because they want to expand more of their land into organic acreage. The demand is there. But what they're most concerned about is it's a 3-year transition that has costs associated with it. During that 3 years, they're not able to market those products as organic. And what happens if in 5 years there's new emergent pests that have made, continuing to farm organically in that land impossible? They want to see that government is going to provide them the support on research for staying ahead of those challenges, on market development, on access, so that they can make the obvious choice to them. So when you show up and you tell a story like that, and you represent American farmers, it's a very different dynamic than maybe where other companies might show up or other conversations might be a little bit more rigid or maybe high level.
Yeah. And in terms of getting into the details, there's a lot of regulations around food, what's in our food, how it's marketed, that's on the table now. And one of them that has gotten a lot of attention is ultra-processed foods. And there's some work now in terms of the department seeking information on what those rules should look like in the future. I think someone would think, given where you're coming from, you would think that's great, but I guess the devils are in the details.
Yeah, like anything, right? The details matter, and it's always more complicated than we want it to be. But I think what you're seeing in the conversation on ultra-processed foods is the right sort of themes from the consumer, the right themes from the individual that's looking to make healthy choices but feels like they're surrounded by difficult choices. So what we hear and what we know is when consumers are asking for more guidance, they're looking for simplicity. They're looking for natural foods. They're looking for clarity. And I think what the sort of conversation on ultra-processed foods has the potential to do if we get it right is make it clear that processing in of itself is not the problem. Fermentation, pasteurization, freezing, these are processes. These are important processes to make food healthy, to make it nutrient dense, to make it accessible. And so we have to be careful not to demonize all processing. But at the same time, we have to find a way to tack the food system and the companies that are operating in it back towards a world where natural foods, minimally processed foods without artificial additives are the primary choices for consumers, and not what it is today, which is tacked the other direction, which is, again, if we can add things to make it cheaper, more efficient, and extend shelf life, that's ultimately best for the business. And so we're trying to help the administration alongside our parent company, Chobani, who has a strong voice in this as well, again, make sure the details land in a good spot, because it's clear the consumer demand is there. Let's not let this opportunity go to waste.
Yeah. So what does that mean in practice? Is it like, I'm at the grocery store and I'm reading, Chobani yogurt and I see, the ingredients on there. Is it that I'm supposed to recognize most of them? Or is it, as you say, some of the process, like the fermentation, et cetera, is obviously, not going to be on the package in that way?
I think one of the reasons the administration is looking into creating a definition is for that reason in sort of its primary cause is how can we communicate to consumers, maybe this could end up with an on-pack claim, for example. How can we communicate to make it easier for a consumer to make that choice so they don't have to make the call for themselves?
And sit there reading for 5 minutes at the grocery store.
Look, we've all heard and probably all would agree that this sort of theme of, if you can't pronounce it, don't buy it kind of a thing. That's maybe it's an overly simplified version of it. But I think myself or my colleagues at Chobani and we admire the goal of trying to simplify the message and create clarity for the consumer. And I think Chobani has really proven this first and foremost. If you make great tasting, accessible, nourishing food, the demand is there. So it's not about necessarily changing what is true, right? It's got to be nutrient dense. It's got to be minimally processed. You want natural ingredients. We got to find a way to carve the path for companies to innovate more that direction and have them be incentivized versus, arguing over processing methods.
Okay. And what about the infrastructure for our food system? Particularly, at a young age, we were talking about programs for school lunches. I mean, that's an issue that's near and dear to my heart with a daughter in elementary school and, every day looking at what's on the menu for her. How do you think our system could be set up better to establish healthier eating habits at a young age?
So this is where I go back to my scientific training, and I think about this through the lens of a systems approach more than anything. Unfortunately, we tend to take complex problems and isolate them down into small little components of it and maybe make tweaks to those dynamics. Should we have more or less funding for school nutrition program purchases, for example? We saw a major cut to those programs earlier this year. I would argue if we really want to uplift schools as the place where healthy, nourishing food is accessible for so many of our children, we're going to have to take a much different approach, a much more infrastructure-based approach to get there. We think about all these other components of infrastructure as a country, right? And we very rarely think about the accessibility of our food as part of that infrastructure. For example, I'm a little bit biased because we're a frozen brand, but I do believe that frozen food is not only one of the most potentially nourishing ways to get there, it's also one of the most accessible if you do it right. But schools would need infrastructure, schools would need support to enable that. Are we thinking about that way in the sort of 3, 5, 10, 20-year milestones that we probably need to? I would argue no. And so we just try our best to make those points as we're engaging, which is unfortunately these are not like one-year budgetary decisions. These are much longer-term objectives.
Yeah, well, and I'm glad you mentioned, the budgetary decisions because there's also a perception that healthier food, organic food costs more. And you see that we're talking about, things going on in Washington, what is happening with SNAP benefits and obviously being hurt by the shutdown, but also, what is the cheapest for people to buy with those benefits? And so how does that factor into incentivizing both the private sector and consumers?
Yeah, I think to some extent it's a choice we make, right? I think as a country we can choose that we want to build a food system that like as I mentioned in the beginning, the North Star is nourishment, not efficiency. That would take change. That would take a commitment from a lot of players that don't normally work together to get there. But I think there are great examples in a microcosm where, nonprofits, corporations, and government have come together to solve problems just like this. That would make a world of a difference. And I think when we start debating and arguing over, again, the sort of small aspects of it, and that gets in the way of maybe a longer-term mentality, that's typically when we get stuck.
Yeah.
And so I'm hoping we'll continue to push through, particularly in this moment. I would argue consumer frustration around the food system is at its highest. And normally change happens when that frustration reaches this tipping point. So let's not waste that opportunity.
Yeah, well, and when it comes to costs, saving on healthcare costs, et cetera, years later, would imagine that would be an incentive as well.
I'd argue one of the problems is we've long treated the healthcare industry and the food industry as two very distinct parts of our existence. And the more we think about them as inextricably linked, the better outcomes we'll create.
Yeah, well, hopefully this process will yield some results. Thank you so much, Ricky.
Thank you.
Please welcome Jake Bullock, CEO of Cannes, and Amna Nawaz, co-host of PBS NewsHour.
Jake.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm doing all right. How about yourself?
I'm good. We're going to talk about hemp-derived beverages, and we're going to talk about responding to some of the claims that were made about your industry in our previous panel as well, because I know you were paying attention. So let's just begin with this. And foundationally, as I mentioned in my interview with Brian Crawford, we're seeing as a lot of Americans are drinking alcohol less, that some are now turning to hemp-derived beverages, sometimes in lieu of, sometimes in a complementary way with alcohol. But Jake Bullock is going to talk about this. You listened to that interview. Just give me your reaction to what you heard in terms of the difference of the regulatory landscape.
Yeah, we should have had a debate. That would have been fun.
Next time.
I think maybe the first place to start is a lot of what we're seeing in the hemp-derived THC space is a result of what's happening with beer, right? Beer's down. There's empty space on trucks. There's empty space on shelves. And hemp THC drinks are really filling that void. Half of our business today in the 30 states where we legally sell into liquor stores is moving to market on beer trucks. And some of them are Molson Coors or ABI affiliated distribution companies. So that's one component of what we're seeing. You also mentioned the consumer. Consumers are drinking less. It's pretty remarkable. No matter who you are, you're drinking less. The younger you are, the stronger that effect is. And everyone seems to be drinking less beer. So I think a lot of the sort of tension is coming from the fact that THC drinks are really emerging as a real competitive threat to beer. In a similar way to how light beer was a moderating force, and you heard Brian kind of talk about that, 20 years ago on the alcohol industry, we're seeing THC drinks being that new wave of moderation. Our best consumers still drink alcohol. We take them from drinking about, double the average, and we bring them back to average. And that's a really good thing. Brian mentioned, it's dangerous. These products are being marketed as wellness products. They're only wellness products if you compare them to the alcohol consumption that drinkers were doing before, right? We're taking people down in alcohol consumption. That's a net positive in their lives. And so I think that's a really important one. He also did a really good job of making the case for the regulation that we want as CAN. We would like to see the FDA provide oversight here. We would like the TTB to be involved. We should be taxed. And many states are doing this already. I think the notion of this farm bill loophole, which is created and now needs to be closed, that's not our experience of operating this business in 30 states today. Something like 22 states since Minnesota started this and passing their law allowing hemp THC in liquor stores have passed real, robust regulatory frameworks that cap the amount of THC, require testing, packaging and labeling guidelines. These products can only be sold to adults 21 plus. And that's the experience in most markets. We test every single one of our products, regardless of whether the state requires us to do that. We're not talking about the nerd gummy clusters here.
I do want to ask you about those, though.
To give you an example, those products may have 200 milligrams of synthetic THC in them. Our products have 2 milligrams. Our most popular drink has 2 milligrams, and it's not synthetic. It's naturally derived from the hemp plant. Those are really important distinctions, potency and natural versus synthetic. A lot of what you're seeing, the state's attorneys general, which signed a letter, that letter was focused on synthetics. We agree. We should ban the synthetics. We should regulate those out of the market. Highly potent products. The whole point of hemp is that it's low potency. So you shouldn't have a 100 milligram hemp product. You shouldn't have a 50 milligram hemp product, right? 2 seems about right, maybe 5. We can have that debate. If you look at the states that have already passed potency caps, they all kind of center around 5. You have some markets like Virginia, which is at 2. Connecticut's also on the low end at 3, and then you've got some that are higher, like Minnesota at 10 and others.
Well, let me ask you more about that regulatory landscape thing, because it sounds like you're saying you would welcome that. Is most of it happening at the state level right now, and what is your relationship to those federal regulators? Because you're regulated, unlike beer, which is under Treasury, right? You're under ag, correct?
Correct. So in 2018, the Farm Bill removed hemp from the Controlled Substances Act. Essentially what that meant is that it was really an agricultural definition, right? 0.3% by dry weight. Dry weight really only makes sense in the concept of the crop. You dry it out, you weigh it, you can extract the cannabinoids and do those measurements. What should have happened then is we should have had some regulatory action by the FDA. This is a potentially novel food additive or supplement. I kind of think it's more like a supplement because you don't want to have 100 milligrams like we said, but you're probably fine having 2. It should be regulated that way. The FDA didn't do that. Instead, what they said is, well, we've already approved cannabinoids in drugs, so they're excluded from the food supply. Epidiolex has CBD in it. Marinol has a synthetic version of THC. It's a little bit wonky, but the FDA basically says you can't have drug in the food supply, and so we can't regulate this. And then there's a standoff happening between Congress and FDA. States have stepped into that void, and they basically said, well, this is legal. It's legal in America for folks to have hemp products, to consume them. But we also recognize that some are more dangerous than others. And so let's put in potency caps, testing guidelines. Let's make sure these are only being sold to adults. 22 states have done that. I think another 30 have rules that allow these products to be sold. That in that absence of federal action, the states have really stepped up. And as a result, you have some markets which are very robust and are functioning well. Like Minnesota was the first to do this. You don't have these problems with nerd gummy clusters in the state of Minnesota like you do in some of the other states. So
because there's more robust state regulation.
There's more robust state regulation. Okay. So our argument is that there should be federal standards. We need them, right? And it should look a lot like how Brian described beer, right? There's an FDA component, there's a TTB component. This is an intoxicant if you have high amounts of it. One of my drinks is not going to be intoxicating. But 2, for some people maybe, 6 definitely would be for most, right? So we need to have some sort of framework and rules. And that should be done through normal rulemaking process, right? This is an audience that understands this. The fact that we're hearing rumors that this might be added into an agricultural appropriations minibus to ban an industry which is $30 billion and has 330,000 Americans employed in it today is pretty terrifying. Let's go through the right process and do this. And there are folks on a bipartisan basis in Congress that are trying to do this. Morgan Griffith has a bill. 8 Democratic senators have signed on to a letter telling Congress not to allow this ban language through. Many more on the House side have done the same as well.
So in terms of how you see yourself, I realize this was all presented in the framework of we were speaking to the beer industry and now we're speaking to you as a representative of viewers. But you mentioned, being featured on beer trucks, filling the empty space that's going out in some places. Is there a difference between the parts of the beer industry that see you as potentially complementary as opposed to a potential competition? Because still, by the numbers, you are dwarfed by them in terms of overall sales, right?
Yeah, we're tiny. And yet we get a lot of anger from them. Yes, there is. To answer your question more directly, I would say that the brands, we directly compete with beer brands. Yeah. If you look at what's happening in Total Wines across the country, which is our biggest retailer, again, we're selling in age-gated liquor stores predominantly. We are taking shelf space from the lowest performing craft beer and some lower performing hard seltzer and RTD. Hard seltzer often is considered in the beer category. So those products are getting pushed off the shelf and we're being replaced with THC products, largely because they sell better and they're more valuable from a margin standpoint to those retailers. Similarly, when you see sort of secular declines in beer, 4 or 5% year after year, there's just space on trucks. Those trucks either have to come off the road and the jobs go away, or they have to fill that space. And you're seeing the big beer distributors take on this category, along with a lot of others, right? If THC drinks didn't exist, Brian would still have a problem. His problem wouldn't be THC, it would be adaptogenic or mocktail type products, right? People are drinking less. They're drinking less for reasons that are unrelated to the presence of THC products.
I feel like I want to bring Brian back on here because we're name-checking each other so much. We'll set up a debate for another time. I do want to ask, though, because that congressional loophole, as we've referred to it, does get brought up a lot. Does that in any way make it easier for you to innovate below that threshold, to be able to push products out to market that don't fit that definition? I mean, that's something that beer doesn't have to deal with, right?
Yeah, it's a good point, right? There are bad actors. We agree about that. There are products out there that are highly potent. They almost entirely are synthetic. It's impossible to get that level of potency if you're doing it the right way, naturally derived from the hemp plant. And they're also breaking a bunch of other laws. Like it is illegal to use the Nerds brand on Nerd clusters or Skittles spelled with a Z, right? We've heard about D9 Oreos. These types of products are infringing on IP and they're marketed towards kids. They should not be allowed. So in that way, it is a real big problem. The biggest threat to our industry today are those bad actors, and we want regulators to help. We shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, however. These drinks are having transformative impacts in people's lives. Whether we debate whether they're a wellness product or not, they're obviously not vitamins, right? But if somebody is telling me we've reduced our alcohol consumption by 50%, maybe some people have taken that all the way down to 0, they're waking up without inflammation, they're sleeping better, they just feel generally better. I had a consumer the other day reach out to me and say, Jake, I used to have 4 or 5 beers. I'm drinking can now instead. I'm a better parent. I'm not as quick to snap at my kids. I mean, that's an amazing, maybe it sounds like a small thing, but it's an amazing thing that's happening in people's lives. we shouldn't just throw that out because there's some bad actors. Like, this is what policymakers do. Let's figure out what good policy looks like here. And the good news is we have 20-something states that are providing a laboratory of that. Maybe not each state individually gets it right. Tennessee might be too high with the 20-milligram cap, right? Maybe Connecticut is too low at 3. But let's go figure out what states are doing this the way that makes the most sense, and then let's get those rules on a federal basis.
Is that a tagline we're going to see? Drinking can makes you a better parent?
We may. We sent an email out to customers earlier this week as we heard some of the rumors of a potential ag minibus with this ban language, and we got over 1,000 responses to a survey. People telling their stories about how these products have impacted them and how they don't want them to go away.
So bigger picture, I mean, what is this? We're in this moment of wellness, and I know a lot of your products are marketed with wellness-aligned language. Is there a cultural shift that you see going on in which there's opportunity for this? Like, what is happening, and who are you primarily marketing towards? Who's picking this up?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, everyone's trying to figure this out, right? You know, is it economic forces? Younger people aren't drinking as much alcohol. Maybe, but I thought that beer was what you drank when, you know, there were economic hardship and inflation, and we're not seeing that. If anything, the lower cost stuff's getting hit the worst. I think something's shifting in how people want to consume alcohol, right? I'm wearing a Whoop today. People are wearing these trackers. It's pretty amazing. You wake up every morning and it's yelling at you for drinking alcohol. Like, that wasn't a factor 10, 15 years ago. I think it's a really powerful one. There's also access to these alternatives, right? I joke a lot of times that you have Gen Zers who can look on TikTok and see alternative ways of socializing. One, they don't actually socialize as much, so they're staying home and they're staying in their parents' home, so there's something going on there. But the fact that they can look out in the world and realize that I don't have to drink alcohol. Like, I went to college, I learned to drink, that was sort of monoculture. We've blown up the monoculture pretty dramatically. And I think one of the casualties of that is this sort of just rote alcohol consumption as the only way of socializing.
So when you look ahead to the next decade, assuming that there will be some sort of additional regulation, I mean, it's fair to also point out beer is a much older industry than yours, right? So the decades to kind of get it right and the language around it. But what does the next decade for can look like? Is it less sort of direct to consumer, online purchases, more in-store? Walk us through that.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of shifts. This industry is moving very fast. We like to say the pace of change is accelerating. Just in this year, you've seen live event folks like Live Nation take these products at festivals. The can was sold behind the bar at every bar at Minnesota Yacht Club, which is a festival in St. Paul, Minnesota, Shaky Knees in Atlanta, Georgia, and many more to come. You've seen big retailers like Circle K announce they're going nationwide next year in the states that allow hemp products with hemp drinks. Target is doing a test in Minnesota in 11 stores. That's pretty remarkable. Some of the largest alcohol distributors in the world are considering taking this category on. I think there'll be more updates and news on that front. So I think you're starting to see a normalization. It's going to look a lot like alcohol, to your point. Most people don't buy alcohol online. It's usually difficult to make the economics work. It's not the case in this category, and that's largely because there's no availability. If you live in a state that doesn't have these products in the liquor store down the street, you can order it online and ship to your door. That's pretty convenient. But if it's available in the liquor store down the street, you're going to go buy it there because you'll save 30, 40%, and you can get it on demand. Similarly, services like GoPuff and DoorDash will provide that. So I think you'll see that the way people buy these products will start looking a lot like alcohol. Where they buy them will look a lot like alcohol, and you'll see this really emerge as a new category of adult beverages.
It'll look a lot like alcohol, but it won't be regulated like alcohol.
Well, right? We would love it to be regulated like alcohol, right? That would be a really good outcome here, right? Let's use the evidence that we have from history on how to regulate adult beverages.
All right, Jake Bullock, CEO of Can. Please join me in thanking him. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For attending today's event, and a special thanks to our partner, Reynolds American. We hope to see you at our next event.